And welcome back to the 45th Annual Norman County Ag Day. Um, Thank you for joining us here on YourLiveEvent.com, Your Live Event YouTube channel. We will be getting started here shortly, so please be patient uh, while we're waiting for the next speakers to come up. But again, thank you for joining us on the 45th Annual Norman County Ag Day. Once again, thank you all for joining us on the 45th annual Norman County Ag Day here on Wiley or YourLiveEvent.com, Your Live Event YouTube page. We will get started here very shortly. Thank you. Thank you.
From the Minnesota Wheat Growers and the Minnesota Wheat Research and Promotion Council with Charlie and Tate. So I'm going to turn the mic over to them, and we are back on our live broadcast too. So thanks to YourLiveEvent.com. They are live broadcasting our presentations today. So here we go. Just hold that.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Like Heather said, I'm Tate Petrie. I am your Secretary-Treasurer on the Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers Board. Farm with my wife and my folks north of Ada. Corn, soybeans, and wheat primarily. Minnesota wheat, you'll see on most of our brochures and stuff, we're oftentimes kind of put together. There's two parts of Minnesota wheat, right? So we have the Growers Association, which is what I sit on, and then the Research and Promotion Council, which is your checkoff. Charlie is in charge of both of those organizations. He's our executive director. And do I run this thing? Yep. Oh, okay. So on the MOG side, just like the Corn Growers Association or others, our primary objective is state legislation and state policy forming. And we also work with our national organization, NOG, to form and influence national policy. So on the state level, we work with Bruce Clavin. He's our state lobbyist. Many of you guys have met him already. He does a great job and helps us a lot with keeping an eye on things that are happening in Minnesota and legislation that we need to weigh in on. Sits on committees and things to keep things going, and so he's been great. Just as a note, we will have a legislative bus trip coming up here in March. It's on the 21st and the 22nd. I believe that's Ag Week down there, right? So I think we're going to do that with Minnesota Farm Bureau and the Ag Gala coming up. So if you have any interest in coming down for that, it's usually a fun couple days. Stay overnight and meet a lot of legislators who are usually really good to talk to, and it's a good time for agriculture to have their voice down there. And frankly, it's just a good experience for a lot of us growers to see how that works. So recently, we also, just as a recent addition, we've actually joined the Midwest Council. So the Midwest Council is the organization working on the federal level with Colin Peterson, who's kind of in charge running that organization. He he's putting together a large group of agribusiness. He's working with the commodity groups to give this upper Northwest and Midwest region a larger say on the national policy making scale. So that's been a really good addition, and we're excited to see where that goes. So Minnesota Association of, the Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers just joined Midwest, and will be members going forward. So. Yep, that's good. Main priorities for MOG this year, just like you heard from corn growers, there's a lot of change in Minneapolis or in St. Paul. So we need to do a lot of work, footwork to educate and help some of our legislators understand the topics and issues that are affecting rural Minnesota and agriculture. Some of you may have already gotten this email today, but dicamba is again going to be a problem on the Minnesota side. We're going to have some state regulations and state labeling requirements that we'll need to keep an eye out for. So one of the things that we've focused a lot on the Minnesota side has been ensuring that we maintain that crop protection toolbox. That's just something that we're concerned that it's going to be a target going forward, and so Bruce and the team down there is doing a really good job of keeping an eye on that. Environment, both on the national and on the state side, has been a really hot topic as well. I've sat on the National Association Environmental Committee for a couple years now, and that's really opened my eyes to the way that policy making on the federal level is really, really complex and difficult, and what works here does not work everywhere. So we've been working really hard to make sure that Minnesota makes our issues known on the national scale, on environmental things and cover crops and carbon programs and all those things that are coming down the pipeline. So that also applies here in Minnesota, between clean water, pesticide use. What else am I missing, Charlie? Anything? So the big ones. So number 3, just like I said before, with the new legislature, we're just really trying to grow relationships and give faces to agriculture. I know a lot of you guys have been, not a lot, but I've seen a few of you guys down in St. Paul for a bus trip, and I think you guys can attest to how effective that tool is to really give legislators someone to talk to and a face to see when they think of agriculture, and that it's not just the big corporate scheme to mine the land. Like, we're really taking care of that ground, and that's our primary focus. So it's important to keep pressure on those legislators and to build those relationships. So so then as far as the national level, I've touched on these a little bit already. The Farm Bill, of course, is a huge focus for us this year, and it will be probably next year if it doesn't go well. Right now we're working on, just in this last week, we've worked a bunch on policy making on the Endangered Species, ESA, which is the Endangered Species Act. It's been kind of used as a tool to limit pesticide use and to enforce regulation. So that's something that NOG has been working really hard on, submitting comments for. Farm Bill, going forward, we've been super active, taking member states and member committee members' opinions on crop insurance. That's, of course, a really important tool that we see as critical going forward. MAP and FMD funding is a really big deal for the wheat associates, making sure that we have those foreign export programs. And then environment, of course, like I've said, has been something we've spent a ton of time on the last couple of years. So then I'll just make the pitch. We really appreciate those of you that are members already, and we'd really encourage the rest of you to, if you haven't, to consider being a member. I think it's got a great value, and we do have some really good opportunities if you want to get involved with the REIT growers to get involved as well. But it's that $85 really goes a long ways to help us fulfill our mission in St. Paul and on a national scale. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Charlie, and he will give you some info.
Well, thank you, Tate. My name is Charlie Vogel. I'm the Executive Director of Minnesota Wheat. Thank you guys for all being here. I'll be brief. The two main buckets that the council has with funding is we are focusing on research and promotion. So the research side is what Missy talked to you about earlier, working with the universities, our on-farm research, and then the funding proposals from university researchers. The other bucket is promotion. So this is where we work with U.S. Wheat to develop overseas opportunities for our end product, for wheat. I had the opportunity to do a Southeast Asia tour earlier this year, and it is amazing how relationships matter in those markets. With the U.S. dollar where it is, it's no secret we're priced out of the market. We are not the bargain commodity when it's purchased in dollars. Those relationships matter to be able to have that quality, that consistency, and then the contact person to go to help them problem solve. And that's why we consistently see the Philippines has 80% market share U.S. wheat. So they can buy cheaper wheat, but they continue to choose U.S. wheat because of those relationships. And that's where some of your dollars are going on the promotion side. On the domestic front, half our wheat is exported, half is consumed domestically. We work with Northern Crops Institute, or NCI, supporting them. They do a lot of product development not through the 4-state region, but the product development doesn't stay here. You'll see when you go through the grocery store, those shelves, when you look at bread and pasta products, they also work with soy and corn as well. It is amazing if you get behind the scenes how many of those products went through the test lab and the development through NCI and Fargo. So very important part of promotion. And lastly, domestically, we work with the National Wheat Foundation on promoting domestically as well. So again, greatly appreciate everyone being here. The one thing I would like to add is Minnesota does an amazing job, in my opinion, of the commodity groups and the ag groups working cooperatively together. This event's a testament to that. We're not adversarial, whether that's on promotion, hosting events like this, or in St. Paul. The groups really work to get together to leverage those dollars. You're being members on each of the organizations. If you're a member of them all, thank you, but I strongly encourage you to at least be a member of one or as many as you can. Those dollars matter and they're making a difference. So thank you for being here, and I'll let it go on.
Any questions? Do you guys have any
Questions?
questions for Minnesota Wheat, Charlie or Tate?
Thank you.
So we're gonna have a quick equipment switch over here before our next speaker. So as they're doing that, we just have to switch out clickers here.
We will join back with the 45th Annual Norman County Ag Day right when all the technical difficulties and the switch outs are done here. We'll get right back to the 45th Annual Norman County Ag Day. Thank you.
Speaker today is Dr. David Key. David is the Director of Research with the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. He's going to talk to us about where our checkoff dollars are going and what's going on with the latest soybean research. So welcome, Dr. Key.
Howdy. I've got to learn to figure out how to do technology here, so we've got some training going on.
I'm going to just put this in your pocket or hang on to it, whatever you want.
I've only got two hands.
In your pocket.
I can do it. Should be able to do it with the space bar too.
Yep.
As Heather said, I'm David Key. I've got to learn to hold the microphone up close to my mouth. I'm used to putting my foot in my mouth, not the microphone in my mouth. Little correction. We have 24 production research projects for FY22. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, all specifically on weed control. We've gone through the evaluation process for FY23. We went through our kill, keep, or discuss evaluation process. We culled 9 of them. We kept 11 of them. And we've got 18 that we're going to evaluate on the 31st. Then once we get that done, we will then recommend those select projects to the full council on the 5th of April for funding of FY23. Focus on weed control because of all the problems that you guys have got. And you got a pile of them. This is what's popping up the most right now. Targeted first project is herbicide-resistant water hemp management research up to date. Devlin Serenge. Devlin tells us right off the bat, we need to focus on where the weak spots at, where the bottlenecks at, the choke points. This right now. You got your tillage done, and right before spring, that's their pre-emerge package just before planting, post-emerge package and cultivation after the soybeans are up. The adult stage, you're looking at enhancing crop competition, getting that row canopy closure on it, possibly doing some hand weeding. Then the new kid on the block, harvest weed seed control. All right, I'm looking across this crowd, and I've just got enough gray heads that may accidentally remember that this ain't that new. They used to put a 55-gallon drum on the end of the thresher and catch a weed seed that came out. That was something that we were doing back in the 40s. Now we're starting looking at doing it now. One of the projects that we're discussing this on the 31st is attacking green stems. We're going to look at desiccation. Who would have thought that we would talk about funding a desiccation project in Minnesota for soybeans? Had increased problems with green stems, which is slowing you guys down. And then that's the other thing is if you look at the option of paraquat on water hemp seed before it's matured, you can knock the germination on those seed down a lot. So it's a double hit. 2 bangs with 1 box. First thing you need to know is when your weeds will emerge. Well, I disagree. First thing you need to know is what weeds you're going to have out there. I need to come to your place. Plant soybeans the end of April to the middle of June. Kochia, you can clean up with your burn down package, some tillage, some good pre-emerge packages. We get down to water hemp, and it's germinating the end of May till early August. Now, we used to take care of water hemp with a cultivator, which brought along the bigger problem of cultivator blight. But now then we cleaned it up with Roundup. Roundup's not working very much anymore. We've developed the layered herbicide package, which is a pre-emerge with residual activity at planting, and then sometime within 6 weeks of planting, a second post-emerge package with a residual at planting, or at that post application. First project that Devlin did was he requested you guys send him samples of seed lots from herbicide-resistant water hemp. If it survived your herbicide program, we want to look at it. Combined, it's about 130 samples. 20 and 21, we also did it for 22, but we haven't analyzed. That's in completion. We then applied 2 different rates: recommended label rate, maximum label rate, and then 3X. A Raptor, Enlist 1, Extendamax, Atrax, Roundup, Liberty, Flexstar, and Callisto. Got a pretty good spread of herbicides there. What do we find out? Raptor does no good. Everything was resistant to Raptor. Now stop and think about that right now. Everything they submitted was resistant to Raptor. How many of you guys have heard about a Raptor problem? 69% of the samples were resistant to Roundup and Raptor. If everything is resistant to Raptor, that means 69% that's resistant to Roundup is also resistant to Raptor. 24% of them were resistant to Atrax and Raptor. 12% of them were resistant to Callisto and Raptor, so on. 4% were resistant to Enlist. Liberty, we got ... there, we got a question mark. Survived the 1X rate, didn't survive the 3X rate, but it came close. So far, nothing's resistant to Extend, but we've had several samples that were resistant to the 1X rate. It just, the 3X rate smoked it. Here's an example. Extendamax, 1X rate. That's a pretty sick water hemp plant. 3X rate smoked it. Enlist 3, 3X rate. It's weak, it's hurt. It ain't dead. And you give it long enough, it sure enough ain't dead. Here's the scary part. 28% of the samples were resistant only to a Raptor. 30% of the samples were resistant to 2 herbicides. 10 of the samples, or 11%, were resistant to 4 or more herbicides. We've got to stay on top of this, guys, or we're going to lose our tools. All right, water hemp and sugar beet rotation. We already know herbicide injury carryover is a big problem with sugar beets. We got a widespread problem with glyphosate-resistant weeds. Sugar beets are not the crop to control the weeds in. So our options are your rotation crops. Soybeans are one of them. Because we've got limited herbicide choices, we need to look at integrated weed management, and we've got to start targeting that seed bank. If you can get your seed down to 1 water hemp plant per acre, I said if, we can do a pretty good job keeping them under control. But if you're starting off with 10 million water hemp seeds per acre, even if we do a 99% control of it, it's a hunk of water hemp seeds to germinate. Let's move on. Research sites for Franklin in 2021, Rosemont last year, Moorhead, but we haven't finished analyzing the data at Moorhead yet. 2 treatment groups, integrated weed management, row spacing 22 inches and 15 inches, using list 3 soybeans as a base crop. 4 herbicide regimes, a low input herbicide, a high input herbicide regime, and a high input plus harvest weed seed control. Treatments 1 and 2 are your non-treated weed control. Means we let the weeds go wild. Weed free, which translates as we had a graduate student that was out in the plots, hoeing the plots every week. Our low input, Valor followed by Enlist, or Outlook followed by Durango. Notice it's followed by, there's no residual in those 2 herbicides. High input, Valor followed by Cobra plus Warrant, followed by Enlist plus Durango. Then Verdict followed by Liberty plus Warrant. So it's that layered system showing up there. Our integrated weed management, high input plus harvest weed seed control. Verdict followed by Liberty plus Warrant, which is number 6, followed by water hemp weed seed removal. Canopy closure data. What was the difference between 21 and 22? Happened in this part of the country too. When did you get planted in 21? Pretty much early. Late April to... When did you get planted in 22? Late. 21, we had enough growing degree days difference. We had the separation when the canopy closed. 22, it was starting to develop, but it was still not there. We could not have a difference, have row spacings may impact canopy closure. The herbicide programs on water hemp control, Franklin, everything worked. Roseau, the Outlook and Durango, and even the Enlist failed to control as well as our high-end product. But the Enlist was, that's going to be somewhere around 90% weed control, which is not bad. It was just less than this Verdict with Warrant, Cobra and Warrant, followed by Enlist and Durango. Here's a picture of the plots. All right, can you point at the soybeans here? Soybeans are relatively easy to find, but you can also see plenty of water hemp in this Outlook, followed by Durango. these guys, pretty much all soybeans. Let me see what happened. Water hemp seed production. Franklin, Roseau. In Franklin, the seed production was pretty much hammered all the way around. And this is millions of water hemp seed per square meter, which is slightly bigger than a square yard. It's about 1.8 million in a square meter on this non-treated control. Roseau, Durango, we still ended up with about 1.8 million in the non-treated control. We're ending up with about 250,000. You can see why it's got out of hand. With water hemp, you can produce a lot of seed with a single plant. Soybean yield. Yield was not impacted by the yield, but the row spacing by chemical treatment interaction was not evident. So there was separate things. Narrow row spacing out yielded a wide row spacing. You've heard this before, but we didn't get an advantage in weed control from it. Non-treated yield, about 18 bushels. In Franklin, about 30. In Rosemont, very similar except for Outlook and Durango. In Franklin, the Outlook and Durango and the Warrant and the Valor and the List definitely yield hits at Rosemont. You're going to see it in your pocketbook. What the take-home message is here, we already know this is on the rise. You've got to look at the integrated management, and you've got to select a strong and diverse water hemp weed control program. This is going to be a problem until we solve it. It's going to be a big problem until it gets solved. This is a study from Andrew Luck, who is in Renville County. Residual herbicides, conventional variable rate technology, mixed crop safety and efficacy. Basically, the way he's saying this is, what can we use out there at what rates that we get significant water hemp weed control and don't ding up the crop. Let's just skip that. Target determined crop safety. We had multiple rates. If you can read this, Next Gen Ag LLC. Write that down. It's also in the book. This full report's on that is on this website. When you look at its experimental design, he had Valor as a base, or blanket Valor as a base, followed with the four combinations of Warrant, Residual, and Flexstar. Then Warrant, this is all that one application pre-emerge package. Then Valor, Warrant, Residual, and Flexstar, with Flexstar as a single post. Then Valor, Warrant, Residual, and then Residual and Flexstar. He's looking at the evolution of the layered program. Same pattern through here. Lots of numbers. When you look at it, 84% weed control is the smallest weed control you got, which is not bad. But let's hop to it. We had 3 treatments that had less than 85% weed control, water M control. These treatments were less than 95 or 90. These were less than 95. So we end up with 8 winners. These are greater than 95% weed control 95 days after planting. These two right here, packages that could be done for an estimated $29 an acre. That's what I said. That ain't too bad. You're not stuck with just using Enlist or just using Roundup or just, you've got some options. What's the problem with that package?
Will they all mix?
You're gonna have to mix it up yourself.
No, but will they all?
So far at the water he's using there, but you're about to jump on my second point. You can do this, but you're going to have a complicated herbicide mix. The minute you get a complicated herbicide mix, you step in the world of wash bucket chemistry, which is you're waiting for something to fall out. And that comes in with your second problem. These guys out here, they know their product exceptionally well. They don't know your water. Only you know your water.
Will they all mix together and not kill each other? That's the next thing.
Well, so far of all these products that they got in Renville County with his water, he did not see any crop damage. But we know that if you get the water wrong, soil is wrong, the pH of the soil wrong, things like this will happen. So as you complicate these herbicide mixtures, you start inviting little problems. Two of these packages, Valor with FlexStar, with a big strong residual program in the front end of it and FlexStar following up, you had 98% weed control over a 2-year period. That's not bad. Final little study looking at voluntary corn. All right, who's got soybeans following corn? Have you noticed there's been a problem with keeping the voluntary corn out of it? Well, we funded a study that looked at this. This is near the Rochester area. We're finding a huge amount of year-to-year variability. Must screen up your video.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Products, tank mixes, timing, rates. There's lots of questions. There's a variable amount of success. And it's the adoption of growth regulator technology has led to a problem. All right. I got to find a youngin'. You're closest one to it. What happens when you mix post and 2,4-D, and why would you do that in the first place? Well, for those of you who haven't, it was in 1983 when I did it, or 84, whenever post first came out. Roundup was still proprietary. We were looking for cheap burn downs. You mix post with 2,4-D amine, should work. You should get all the seedling broadleaves, should get all the seedling grasses. Boom. Grasses didn't die. So we've known that 2,4-D can inhibit the grass herbicides for a long time. We just forgot about it since '96. They did a survey in 2020-21, 53% of Minnesota's farmers will plant E3 soybeans. 19% will plant extended flax. 32% will plant extend. That adds up to more than 100%. We know we could see a problem coming. Antagonism was known to occur. We saw it with the Sure first, most what we saw with the Select Max. We looked at radiant timing, adjuvants. Objective of this program was to determine the most cost-effective herbicide program for weed and voluntary corn control. The second one was evaluate potential for herbicide antagonism. These were the two big ones. Now, the segmented study is stable. Treatment 1 is untreated. Treatment 2 is weed-free. Treatment 20 is weed-free. Treatments 2 through 9 are 2,4-D, choline, plus Select. Treatments 10 through 17 are 2,4-D choline plus Assure. The Select were the low rate and high rate. Low rate and high rate. Then difference AMS plus non-ionic. What am I trying to say? The sticker. Various adjuvants. And then 17 or 18 for the high rates, the lower rates, the lower rates of Select or lower rates of Assure. But they weren't applied with the 2,4-D, they were applied following the 2,4-D. (2,4-D) was applied as Enlist, glyphosate as PowerMax, S-metolachlor as Dual, clethodim was Select Max, 2 rates 6 ounce per acre for low, high rates 9 ounces per acre. 5 minutes. Assure 2 at 4 or 12. Bang. What does that tell you right off the bat? Treatment 1 is the untreated weed control. Treatment 20 is the hand weeded. Treatments 2 through 9 are Select. Treatments 2 and 3 are the low rates. Treatments 10 through 17 are the Assure. Treatments 10, 11 are low rates. Treatments 14, 15 are the low rates. When you mix 2,4-D with grass herbicides, you're going to get dinged. One of the ways of handling it is just up the rate of your grass herbicide. What's the problem with that? Costs money. Soybean yield. 1's the untreated control, 20 is a weed free. 2 and 3. The Select, soybean yield at the Select products were not impacted that greatly by the antagonism. You can definitely see it with treatments 10, 11, 14, and 15. That antagonism hurt your yield on the soybeans in Rochester. Will it hurt your yields up here in Norman County? If you do it right, probably not. If you make a mistake and you get in a hurry, probably will. I'm going to jump through this real quick. We're short on time. To wind this program up real quick for you, we can control herbicide-resistant weeds. They're out there. We've got methods of controlling it. Guess what? You don't have to pick just one package. You can tailor make your packages. But as you increase the complexity of your herbicide program, you're going to increase the problems with antagonism. And I'm done. Any questions?
Yes.
The water. What were you saying about the water? What the difference with the water?
Your water ain't her water.
Yeah, I know, but what should we look for?
What's the biggest volume occupier in your tank? You got mainly water in that solution.
Yeah.
So your water, which is different from his water, mixed with their products, can have two different results. Typically, it's associated with salts, but it can be associated with pH, it can be associated with organic matter, it can be associated with a number of different products in the water. You're the only one who knows your water. And if you haven't looked at it, this process will force you to look at that water.
So what should we be looking for?
I
Is
would,
there a way to have it tested?
yes, sir. You get it tested to county level. First off, just your water well testing program.
Yeah, okay,
That'll give you a lot of data.
okay.
Now, will it give you enough data? Maybe not. Well, one of the other problems I've got with antagonism is there's two types of antagonism. First off, where it causes a precipitation of the solution and it just falls out of the bottom of the tank and clogs up your jets. The second thing, it doesn't do that. The herbicide just doesn't work. Which is worse? Well, you can sit there and clean up all your filters and cuss and learn a new language, or you can watch all the money you put out go down the drain because the herbicide package didn't work. You'll remember sweating and cussing, but your tax accountant will remember the other one. Yes, ma'am.
Have you dealt at all with mixing AMS with your water first before? Like I've heard of mixing that with your water.
You want to mix
chemicals
you want to mix the AMS up first.
before adding other chemicals.
Yes, ma'am.
To get your like.
You want to get
and
the
everything right. Is that
if
like
you
a
look
thing?
at if you look at your adjuvants,
Yeah.
they're different chemical products, and the AMS works on the the salt balance, and it's the calcium, magnesium, aluminum, iron, and you've got to have that dissolved. So you got a free floating sulfate in there to associate with these positive cations like aluminum, iron, calcium, magnesium, even sodium. If it's not floating out there, it can't react. So then they react with herbicide. It's kind of like scrambling eggs. It's a lot easier to take the shell out first. How you do it's up to you. But if you just throw it in there and scramble it before you take the shell out, you've got this stuff precipitated out in your eggs. Any other questions? Thank you so much for your time.
All right, we had to do a quick slide change here and some equipment updates here. So thank you to David Key for his presentation this afternoon. We'll move into our next presentation. Our speaker is Lindsay Pease. She is the Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist in Nutrient and Water Management with the University of Minnesota Extension. Lindsay's presentation is going to give us a look back at our subsurface drainage, and then along with how cover crops and biologicals have performed. So welcome, Lindsay, and we'll let you take over here.
All right, so this should be okay for sound? Great. Okay, hi everybody. And as Heather mentioned, I'm the soil scientist at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center, but I really focus a lot on both nutrient management and water management, and often how those two coincide with one another. So I'm gonna talk about just a little bit about a bunch of the different projects we had going on last year at the Research and Outreach Center. A lot of these projects, they're in their first year, so I don't have a ton of really definitive results to share, but I just wanted to kind of let you know what the types of things we're working on and what we did learn in this last year in 2022. So one of the big things that is always, let me not stand right in front of the screen here, one of the big things that we always want to think about, we want to talk about, is rainfall. And in 2022, the blue lines are what we saw last year, and in orange is 2021. Is it better if I stand? Okay. And the black dashed line that you see on the screen, that's our 10-year average, and I put average in quotes because what is an average year, and do we ever see one? But you know, if we're getting close to that average, it can be on that line. But what really struck me about looking at the differences between 2022 and 2021, I mean, boy, that drought of 2021 was just brutal. We just got nothing the whole year. That's what's in orange. And in 2022, we actually did a little bit better early in the season, but just ran out of water late. So, you know, that late spring, cold spring, you know, that was really hard for getting the crops established. And then as kind of we progressed into the season, we got less and less water, which was kind of the reverse of 2021 in that, you know, late in 2021, we actually started to get some rains. Those just didn't come for us in 2022. And you know, and so that was one of the things, you know, what we started to look at in 2022 was these different biological products. That's kind of a hot topic right now. There's a lot of products on the market and more coming out all the time. And each of them have different ways that they're interacting with the soil. But two of the products that we tested at NWROC this past year, one of them was a plant growth promoting bacteria. This is a nitrogen fixing bacteria that we applied with wheat seed in the spring. We actually also had this experiment in 2021, but as you can imagine, with no water, we got no growth. So in 2022, we were, you know, fingers crossed that we were going to see something slightly better. But the other product that we tested, so more on that in the next slide, the other product we tested was kind of one of those mid-season foliar sprays on soybeans. So our biologicals with spring wheat, we also had this compared side by side with a nitrogen rate trial. One of the things that we saw was no yield difference depending on if we applied the product or not, or whether we applied fertilizer or not onto our wheat. So, you know, something else is going on when you don't even see any kind of a fertilizer response. And so that's what I had here, you know, a kind of a question mark. You know, what was our soil moisture? Were we having soil moisture problems in those plots? Is that why we didn't see, you know, from no difference if we applied 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen or 120 on our spring wheat? That's not normal. And we had another plots, and this was wheat following corn, and kind of saw the same thing, whether we were following soybeans or following corn. No response with or without the product, but then also no response to that fertilizer. One of the things that I kind of started to think about in terms of this, like following corn versus following soybeans, is whether there might have been residual nitrogen left from poor yields in 2021 that then was kind of eliminating that fertilizer response all across the board. And one of the clues that kind of tipped me off to that is our wheat following corn was up around 70 bushels per acre. Following soybeans was down at 50. So we had two different places, those are two different spots in the research station, so they might have different levels of background soil moisture, nitrogen levels, those sorts of things. So something else is going on, which was kind of unfortunate, because that's why I have a bunch of trials all mashed together, because I can't really give you a good answer on whether or not this biological product worked or not, because we have other things besides nutrient management happening in these plots. We also tried, like I mentioned, that mid-season foliar spray on soybeans. But this photo, which is probably a little bit hard to see, but what you can see is how saturated those soils are. We had one of those really huge June rains on this field, like days after we seeded the soybeans. So basically we planted late, got the seed in, then had like an inch or 2 inches of rain over the weekend. So when we came back out the following week to try to start doing some field work, they were underwater. The plots were just underwater the early part of the season. And then by the end of the summer, that same field, you can see this is silty clay loam soil that we had, huge cracks in that soil, just like you would have seen in 2021 during the drought. So we started out super wet. Soybeans do not like wet feet, that we know. They also didn't like the fact that they ran out of water late in the season. So it was too much and then too little. And again, we saw no effect of the fertilizer application on this trial either. So, we had some different phosphorus rates applied out there for a rate trial, and again kind of showing us that we weren't limited on nutrients this past year. We were dealing with these effects of rainfall. So cover cropping. I won't be talking about our planting green trial because you'll have to stick around for Angie's talk next, where she's going to be talking about that. But that trial was we're working on how green seeding soybeans into a living rye cover crop works. But we're also doing some cover cropping in sugar beets, which is a little bit tricky. But one of the things we tried to do was interseed cover crops into a growing sugar beet crop this past summer. But first, one kind of note that I will say, and I'm sure Angie will talk more about generally results, but just one thing about the planting green that I wanted to show is that if you don't terminate your rye and then you try to plant soybeans into it, you will have problems getting those crops to yield. This was at the West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris. That these are both plots, and you can see in the kind of background of that photo just how much that rye really took over those plots, because we were looking at termination timing as a treatment, but in this case, and I've heard others say this, we're doing this so you don't have to. Don't let your rye head out if you're planting a cover crop and trying to green seed into it. But Angie's going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I just kind of think this picture shows a really good visual difference of, what not to do. So interseeding these sugar beets, we actually built a custom interseeder for this using a Gandy unit to be able to drop cover crop seed in between the beet rows. We did this for about a little over $8,000, which is like a pretty approachable cost of an interseeder. We had kind of the tractor, and we had to buy a toolbar, and we had to get the Gandy unit. The guys that work at the Research and Outreach Center put this thing together, calibrated it for seed, and by July, we were able to run it through our growing sugar beet plots, and you can kind of see this is right after we ran it through. So the canopy had not closed yet. We had to kind of time this based on when we were able to kind of get away with not spraying for weeds anymore, because we didn't want to kill the cover crop with an herbicide spray, but we also didn't want the canopy to be closed. They came up, which was good, which was exciting, but then they died. So they also, they didn't make it even to the lifting process. That was really one of the big things we wanted to see. There's you can basically just see bare ground in the picture and some dead residue. They didn't even make it to the lifting process, and we ran out of water again. But also, I think, we probably could have gone with a heavier rate. When we were applying some of that cover crop seed, I was kind of thinking in my head, that really doesn't seem like we're putting enough down to be able to outcompete, that canopy. But, those are the types of things as a research trial you can't change on the fly. So we were stuck with it, even though my gut was telling me that might not be the right rate. And we're going to try this again next summer. And lastly, I'm going to talk about subsurface drainage research. And this is kind of one of my favorite things to work on up here is drainage research. And you guys may not know that the coolest drainage plots by minimum annual temperature are just 40 minutes north in Crookston. So, that's something I always like to joke with about, because there are drainage plots elsewhere. We get the title of being the coolest. And I'm going to be talking about, we have two different drainage experiments going on, two different sets of plots. One of them is talking about just how we're seeing yields change with drained and undrained. We have a 60-acre field that we have done tile drainage on half of it and then left the other half undrained. I'm actually not going to talk about that one again today. I know there's kind of a lot of stay tuned, but I'm going to be talking about those plots a lot more in depth tomorrow and then later on in the month. So, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the other drainage experiment I have going on, and that is some drain spacing work that we're doing. These plots are about 20 years old. Joachim Wiersma had done some research on these plots back in the early 2000s, and they kind of sat with nobody doing anything with them until I got here. And we have been looking at a combined drain spacing and disease treatment trial with them. We're looking at different fungicide treatments for dry beans and then different seed treatments for wheat, and seeing whether or not, soil moisture conditions with these different drain spacings has any effect on disease treatment. And what we're seeing with our wheat is that yield was significantly affected by our drain spacing this past year, but not by the seed treatment. So again, we're seeing that kind of same pattern of we're seeing things happening with moisture and that affecting the crop, and not so much what we're actually doing with our management decisions, which I think is really important to keep in mind. Our seed treatment versus the non-seeded control with these different seed treatments for wheat, no difference. But we did see our better yields in kind of our 40-foot spacing for wheat. And 40 feet is really, if you were to go to a tile contractor and say, well, what kind of spacing would you recommend? Usually that comes back as kind of the sweet spot between the expense and kind of draining the field in a reasonable time. So that's actually a really good kind of result from what you might actually put out in your field. And I don't have a graph for this one, so this is a chart, but I kind of pulled out some of the bigger details alongside here. But really, what we saw in navy beans was a little bit different, actually. So these are in the same piece of ground, they're just in strips. In navy beans, we actually saw the narrower drain spacings with our fungicide treatment yielded better at the end of the season. And I think this has to do with that same thing I mentioned earlier. Soybeans and, dry beans don't like wet feet, so that wet spring having the narrower spacing actually did help these beans grow a little bit better. And that was not true for our wheat, but it was true for our beans. And we saw higher yields with our in-furrow treatment and narrower drain spacings, but we saw lower yields with our undrained and wider drained spacings, and obviously when you didn't apply any fungicide because these were inoculated for the disease. So just to kind of summarize all of that up, that is a lot of information, but I think a lot of the message that we're seeing is pretty much the same, and it's that the big factor that we had to contend with, and that you have to contend with every year, really is the weather and soil moisture. So the story of 2022 is, again, that story of rainfall. And I think rainfall patterns really do seem to be the biggest, and, coming off of a drought and then coming off of, 2022, which again, wet early, dry late. It almost didn't matter what we did in the field. Our yields were our yields, which is kind of like tough to take in. That's the one factor that you can't change, is what's falling out of the sky. But I will say, to not underestimate water management as part of as your broader management strategy. I personally do think that drainage really can help in a lot of ways. It can help get in the field a little bit earlier. And even though there's a lot of questions about some of these other biological products and other things that you could be doing with your soil, sometimes drainage is, it's something I can tell you that it works and why it works and when it won't work, which is something that at this point, I can't tell you about some of these other products that you're adding on to your fertilizer treatments. And again, this is just kind of the picture of the rainfall that we experienced. To hear more about these, because this is a quick overview of a lot of different things, stay right here. Listen to more about cover crops for Angie's talk next. There is going to be more information from Dan Kaiser, who's my counterpart in the Twin Cities, talking about biologicals at a strategic farming webinar. That's going to be free online. February 8th at 9 a.m. There's a link here, but also if you just Google strategic farming and biologicals, that will come out. Also, you can talk to any of us extension folks and we will get you the information. Because Dan Kaiser, he's done a lot more testing of these products over the years than I have. So, he has a kind of a longer track record than just 1 year to work with. And more information on drainage. I'm going to be talking specifically about those drainage research plots tomorrow in Crookston at the Research Update for Ag Professionals, but then also at Best of the Best in Grand Forks and Fargo in February. So there's just kind of some pitch for hearing more about drainage. And with that, I also put my contact information up here. A really good way to reach me, I'm kind of old school, is by phone. And if you want, and I'm not sure how we're doing on time.
Good.
Okay. And it can answer some questions.
Yeah, 10 minutes, so you're good.
I guess I talked kind of fast.
Questions for Lindsay? Nobody has questions tonight. It's been a quiet group for questions today. Okay. Andrew, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
What product do you guys use for your biological?
Yeah, so on the wheat, that was, it's actually a product that Paolo Pagliari, who's my counterpart at Southwest Research, he sourced it from Brazil. It is an Azospirillum species. That's one that's actually not commercially available yet, but again, it's kind of like open source. So the way that bacteria is working is to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, kind of similar to how, the soybeans and the rhizobes have that kind of mutual relationship. One of the things we're kind of working on the side is trying to isolate a bacterial species that will have the same function but is native to our soils. So so that's kind of the bigger picture on that.
I was just curious about whether we know the prevalence of drainage up here.
Yeah, the prevalence of drainage, that's a tricky question to actually answer because it's something that gets reported, it's all these different tiling companies and they kind of have their own records. The only place you can really see is on the U.S. Census of Agriculture, where sometimes people will report if they're drained or undrained. I would say in this area, the last time that I looked at that data was probably from the 2017 census, and it was like less than 10% of fields were tiled. But then again, we've had 2020, we've had some really wet years, and I hear that the tiling contractors are pretty busy. So I do know that more and more is going in, including my field that was tile drained in 2019. And so it's something that's growing. And I think, Norman County, you guys are kind of in a difficult spot right here. Some of you are farming on sands. Some of you are farming on heavy clays. Really, if you're at that kind of silty clay, loam, or heavier, I would really take a serious look at tile drainage and thinking about, whether that budget's out, because it's just one of those things. It just helps you those couple extra days in the spring. I'm not paid to say that by any means. It's just my personal belief is that it can really help, especially if you're closer you are to the river, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Presentation that's going to be part of the larger strategic farming series of webinars. I think you said it was February 8th. Yeah. So that's going to be Seth Nave. He is our soybean agronomist, and Dan Kaiser. He's the nutrient management specialist. They've been a part of a large, basically Midwestern, so all of the states, I believe it's 12 states in the north central region, where they've been testing some of the more heavily advertised biologicals that you've been hearing a lot about in the farm press. The one that comes to mind is Pivot Bio. I'm not sure if they looked at other ones too, but just know that they're going to be presenting on many locations of data, and I think it might have just been from this last year.
Great. So Angie is our next speaker, Angie Peltier. She is the regional crops educator with University of Minnesota Extension. So she's going to talk about planting green along the red here, as we've been indicated by a couple presentations today. So it'll be good. So I'm going to let you take over, Angie. She's getting set. I just want to make sure to mention too that if you need your pesticide applicator recertification, that will be here in Ada on February 16th. In the morning session, we'll have the Advanced Nitrogen Smart program, the deep dive into the 4 R's with Dan Kaiser and with Brad Carlson. And then also in the afternoon, we'll start our recertification meeting at 1 o'clock. So Angie and I will be presenting that recertification program for you guys here in Ada. So.
Okay. I'm going to stand back here. Thank you for staying. I sure appreciate it. You hate to see the room clear out after lunch, so I appreciate it. The ADA crew is always a great crew. I enjoy seeing all your faces, so thanks for coming out today. Heather introduced me. I'm going to introduce the project and why we really wanted to have this particular project. So again, my name's Angie Peltier. I work up in Crookston. We do have another pesticide applicator training that's going to be held at UMC in Bede Ballroom next Friday afternoon. So if you happen to live closer to Crookston or you're not available on the date of the ADA recertification workshop, we are holding one next week Friday. And in the Northwest, that's going to be our inaugural kickoff sort of workshop. So thanks again for coming. So how many of you have in the past grown a cover crop? So some crop that is grown for some sort of ecosystem service and is not grown to basically harvest something to sell. How many people? So how many people would like to experiment a little bit? Well, a couple folks. So a couple people have both experimented with cover crops before, and a couple people have an interest in experimenting on cover crops. And that's sort of the impetus of this project. Whether it's us wanting to be able to hold on to our soils, we have fewer soil storms in the valley, which is a big deal at my house because being a relatively new transplant to the valley, we didn't realize that you shouldn't leave the house with your windows open. And I learned that lesson the hard way. But I think that all of us learn that lesson because that soil is doing me no good on every surface throughout my entire house. And it's doing you guys no good because it could be making you some money if it stayed in the field. And so whether it's for environmental or ecosystem services, whether it's because at some point cover crops or some sort of conservation practice similar to cover crops are mandated, we just thought it's really important for us to be able to establish a series of management recommendations for folks up in the Northwest and then down in the west central region of the state. And so I'd like to first thank our sponsors. There's many of them, but your checkoff dollars, so Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council went to fund this project. All of the rest of these folks provided in-kind donations, so Minnesota Wheat Research and Promotion Council and their Growers Association, Minnesota Ag Services, Bayer Crop Sciences, Extension, and then Agassiz Seed and Supply. So we had 5 different farmer sites, so on-farm locations. We had a total of 7, but 2 up in our region were dropped. One, the farmer actually died over the winter, and so we couldn't carry on. And then the other one, it was so dry last fall that the farmer had real worry about putting down a cover crop, seeding a cover crop, and having that affect his 2022 cash crop, even before he planted it. And so he kind of bowed out too. But this is a map of the western part of the state. Here's one location in the Northwest. This is Gently. And then we have 4 different locations down in the West Central. So I'm going to show a similar map like this each time I present some data. And that's just to kind of orient you where we are in the state. So all of these locations had very large plots. And that was to accommodate the farmers' own equipment. So this was also part of the Minnesota Wheat On-Farm Research Network as well. Let's see. So we had 4 different treatments at each of the locations. So you always have to have some sort of control. So our control was no cover crop, but the tillage regime that was the farmer's preference. All of the other treatments had a cover crop. Here we planted winter rye in the fall in 2021. And then those rye treatments were terminated at different times in relation to soybean planting. So that was kind of our benchmark. We wanted to go early, so 1 to 2 weeks before soybean planting, at soybean planting, and then 1 to 2 weeks after soybean planting. Our goal here is to try and find that sweet spot where we can get those ecosystem services but aren't necessarily affecting your cash crop with the growth of a cover crop. So we had a couple of different ways that rye was established in the fall of 2021, and it really had to do with the previous crop. So up in Gently, our northernmost location, that's up in Polk County, that was after wheat. That's where we felt that unless somebody's growing corn for silage, that's really where a cover crop would probably fit best within our larger cropping system as it currently stands. And so that's what we decided to do. So after wheat, and then after corn grown for silage, wheat was drilled because we could actually get into the field. 40 pounds to the acre of rye was planted. But for those fields where corn was grown for grain, they wanted it to sit out there and dry a little bit longer, we used a drone. And so we aerially seeded, broadcast seeded into these plots at 3 different locations down in the west central part of the state. And those locations, like I said, it was a drone. They had to, there's a video, I don't have it on here, I don't believe, but we did, knowing that there's gonna be losses with broadcast seeding. You're gonna have some of those seeds fall into the whirl, and you're gonna have a lot of seeds fall into the bellies of voles and other, rodents out in the field. And so we increased the seeding rate in the broadcast fields to 56 pounds per acre. So one of the things, like I said, we want to find that sweet spot. So one of the things we wanted to do was to see how much rye we could actually grow in those different termination timing plots. And so we collected rye biomass right before termination. We terminated all of the rye plots just with straight up glyphosate, Roundup. And we used some really high tech equipment. So this is a hula hoop. Scissors, and some old grocery bags, paper grocery bags. That's the equipment we used there. Put it in a dryer and figured out just how much dry matter was produced. So just to orient us, so I know I have a hard time thinking about how much rye it is, but one large square bale is equal to about 600 pounds. And so in this experiment, we collected anywhere between a quarter of one of these large square bales all the way up to almost 8 large square bales. Now granted, because we terminated all of our plots, all of our rye plots in relation to soybean planting, Lindsay just got done reminding us about how wet it was this past spring. Our termination timing, along with planting, was delayed. And so I'm not sure that we would end up with tons, close to 8 of those large square bales of rye in a typical growing season. So we will be doing these experiments for an additional 3 years with the help of our farmer cooperators. And so we'll get to see just how representative or not representative the 2021-22 set of data actually is. So just as a reminder, this is a yield map. Here the red areas for wheat, that's about a 70 bushel per acre wheat yield. And the green areas of this field in the yield map, that's about 90 bushels per acre. And that's just background. That's background variability. And this is just to kind of remind us all that farm fields are are very variable environments. Even if it's, let's say you're in the valley here and it's straight as an arrow, you lose elevation in a mile, you lose a couple of inches, for example. That's still a very variable environment. And so we've tried through replication and randomization, and where we cite these plots, for example, we'd want to put in the plots at a more uniform area of the field, because in order to be able to detect differences among treatments, we need to look at that variability, and that underlying variability can complicate our ability to tell the differences, especially if they tend to be small among different treatments. Okay, so first site I'm going to be presenting. This is our southernmost site. This was our only irrigated site, and the soil was a loam to a sandy loam soil. This farmer's preferred tillage practice was ridge till, because he grew corn the year before for grain. We used the drone to seed the rye. There was a lot of corn residue, and I'm going to show you a picture here in a second. That corn residue really seemed to affect our cover crop establishment, because I'll show you the cover crop biomass data. We just couldn't grow tons of rye at this particular field for that reason. So what I'm going to show you at each of these locations is a series of pictures. Is there a way to cut off the lights just here in the front? So the goal of showing you these pictures is so that you can see how the soybeans grew. Oh, maybe not. Well, there we go. Okay, don't trip anybody. So this is just to show you, all of these pictures were taken at the same time, and this is just to show you how the soybeans were able to grow when there was this rye potentially competing for resources with the soybeans. And so what you can see here on the far left, this was these were plots where the rye was terminated 13 days after planting. We only grew 384 pounds of rye per acre. If you compare it to the at planting termination timing of the rye, we only grew 146 pounds of rye per acre at May 10th, our planting date, but you can see the soybeans are taller. They tend to have a slightly larger canopy starting when compared to the later termination timing. Here is no cover crop. So what I'm showing you here, this is the no cover treatment. And you can see the soybeans are growing even better still here. And lastly, this gentleman didn't have a before planting treatment, so he went 38 days after planting. That's his last termination timing. Obviously not recommended, but he just said go for broke. So let's see. So I'm going to explain this graph because I'm going to be showing you 5 of them. Okay, in red, we have this axis on the left. This is yield in bushels per acre. Each of these bars then is the yield for each of the treatments listed below the bars. Above the bars, that's the yield in bushels per acre. On the left-hand axis, that's biomass. So that's rye biomass in gray here. The gray line is also rye biomass, just so you can see how much biomass there was with each of these plots. Oftentimes you'll be able to see between our different treatments little white letters on the bars. If you see letters on the bars, those treatments with the same letter are statistically similar. So we ran all of this data through some stats and found that at the 90% confidence level, they either are or aren't different, these particular treatments. And so that's just to orient you. If you forget or need some clarification, just interrupt. At each of these locations, At each of these locations, we also tended to have complicating factors. Now I'll list those out too. But what I wanted to show you before moving on is that even though that we had a range here between the no rye plots, which yielded more than 46 bushels to the acre, and the after planting rye termination timing, which yielded almost 37 bushels per acre, there was so much variability that the statistics told us that we can't make heads or tails of this data. We can't detect any differences. So maybe if we had many more replications, we might have been able to detect differences, but we just don't know. Here's some of the complicating factors. You can see, if you remember, this gentleman ridge-tilled, and it seemed that there was so much corn residue between the ridges that the rye never seemed to establish between the ridges. It only made some soil contact on top of those ridges themselves. Other issues, complicating factors, seed corn maggot, brown stem rot, bean leaf beetle. There was some herbicide carryover injury. This was just kind of like the kitchen sink sort of field. And then luckily I'll show you the list of our collaborators, but luckily they were there when he was going in to freshen up his ridges, the farmer was, because the ridge tiller actually chopped up all of the rye, so they were able to go in there and grab the biomass samples. Browns Valley, so this is a location that's kind of jutting out and into South Dakota there. Like I said, the rest of these trials were all rain-fed. This one here was a clay loam soil, and the farmer's preferred tillage regime was no-till. The drone, again, applied the rye, so broadcast rye. Here, because of the no-till most likely, the corn was shorter at planting time, allowing a lot more sunlight to reach the soil. With a timely rain event, that cover crop can kind of take off. So there was much more cover crop grown at this particular location. Okay, here's the pictures. So on the left, this is the no-till, no-rye plot. You can see there's a lot of residue in these plots. The second one, the second picture in from the left, that's the before planting termination timing. You can see here, 13 days before soybean planting, they were able to grow on average close to 1,300 pounds of rye in that particular treatment. At planting, which happened May 23rd here at Browns Valley, we're able to grow close to 3,100 pounds of rye. That's a lot of rye. And then waiting an additional 10 days after planting added an additional, almost 1,700 pounds of rye. So there was a lot of rye there. Here's the data then. So what you can see, these letters, remember how I was telling you, these letters show that this particular treatment, the after planting termination timing, was statistically lower as far as yield is concerned than all of the other treatments. So the no rye treatment, the before planting and then at planting rye termination timing treatments, all of those yielded similarly. And so here the only yield penalty this particular gentleman got was waiting until after planting to terminate. One other thing to mention here, that's rye terminated after planting. It never did lay down. Okay, it had reached, I see some chuckles in the audience. So it had reached the reproductive growth stages, and it's not going to lay down. So what we would really recommend is if you, for some reason, have kind of a train wreck in your field, one thing we know is that if you can't get it terminated before it goes reproductive, you should probably try to roll it, because otherwise it'll never make soil contact within the growing season and won't begin to break down. Okay, there were many complicating factors here. What this is, I'm going to explain it to you. This is actually a cow patty. So there were winter cattle that grazed on these particular plots. Every single plot where they grazed, what are they going to graze? The rye. All of the rye plots tended to have more weed pressure than the other plots, the no rye plots. And so one of the things we were also looking at in these trials was weed pressure. And so here that's a definite complicating factor. He also had grown alfalfa 2 years previous, and we were still dealing with some volunteer alfalfa in these fields. And so you take a look here at this particular picture. Right there in that little yellow circle, that's volunteer alfalfa that really affected our soybean yield. So there were patches. The alfalfa might have affected our soybean stand in those areas, and it definitely had an effect on yield. Let's see. So Tinta, this is the northernmost of the 4 southern or west central locations. This was also rain-fed, was a silty clay loam soil. Again, here the farmer's preferred tillage practice was no-till. The previous crop was silage, so this was our one on-farm location in the west central region that was where the rye was drilled in. And this will become a little bit more clear why I'm telling you this in a second, but this particular field didn't use soybeans that were treated with a fungicide. So what you can see here is on the left, that picture is the no-till, no-rye plots. The second from the left, that's 22 days before planting. That's the rye termination that took place 22 days before planting. And he was able to grow roughly 1,400 pounds of rye per acre. More than doubling that when he waited until planting, which you can see here was June 8th. You can also see that rye standing up there, right? Look at so here, you can still see a pretty good soybean row here. Here you really have to strain to see the soybean row. This is 9 days after planting, so this is, I believe it's 22 days between this treatment and this treatment, and it can put on a lot of biomass in 22 days. So it added on an additional 1,000 pounds of rye in those 22 days. Here you can see that the after planting rye termination tended to yield the lowest, which no surprise when you saw that last picture, most likely. Our at planting termination timing, they were able to add on another 3.5 bushels to the acre. But our no rye plots and the before soybean planting rye termination timing, those yielded similarly. So there was no yield penalty to having rye when it was terminated before planting. Complications. So this is an aerial picture taken by one of our collaborators, and there were some major root rot issues in this particular field. So like I said before, the gentleman didn't plant a soybean with a fungicidal seed treatment on it. We have submitted to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture a grant proposal so that we can go out and see whether we have any increase in pressure of root diseases for having a rye cover crop, because that seems to be the one that's most popular because you can establish it latest in the growing season. And so we really need to know if you really absolutely need to have a soybean seed treatment due to fungal pressure. One more complicating factor, all of that rye that stayed standing, that all had to move through the combine too. And so in that after planting termination timing, his harvest speed was reduced by a full mile per hour. Now, as you can imagine, that doesn't make anybody happy, and probably wasn't a good day. Barrett. So this is our easternmost location. This was also rain-fed, clay loam soils. This gentleman preferred fall vertical tillage. His previous crop was corn grown for grain, and so the rye was seeded with a drone. One thing we noticed here was he would have been able to get into the field a little bit earlier if he didn't have to plant all of the soybeans at the same time across all of the treatments. He saw that the field would have been fit to plant if he was just planting on the rye plots, but because he also needed to plant the control plots at the same time, he had to hold off a little bit. But that was just a bit of anecdotal evidence that he was able to provide. Here's the results. Here's his vertical tillage. This is just, you might be able to see the green there. This is just when soybeans started to emerge. 10 days before planting, rye termination, he was able to grow 1,100 pounds of rye. He doubled that when he terminated rye at planting, which in this case was May 27th. 12 days after planting, he just added another 400, 500 pounds of rye here. And you can see in the no rye plots, he had a much higher yield here when compared to all of the cover crops plots. And so what we're seeing is just each location, each set of circumstances, we're getting different results. So that's why we do these trials multiple years at multiple locations. So this was one of the wetter fields. There was also a lot of corn residue in this particular field. So you can probably see that there. Here's our northernmost location. So this was also rain-fed. This field is maybe 2 miles tops from my house. So I happen to know it's pretty darn sandy soil. At my house, it got so dry after the drought in 2021 that when we started to get rain in late September, early October, you could actually see air bubbles coming out of the ground across all of our land, because all of our soil, which was pretty much sand after the first 8 inches, like seriously beach sand, that there was no water in that soil to begin with. So this particular field, pretty darn sandy soil. He also preferred fall vertical tillage. His previous crop was wheat, so he was able to drill the rye in after that wheat crop. Here's what it looked like. So here's his fall vertical tillage plots. Here's, he was able to grow when terminating rye 11 days before planting. Oop, that's telling me I'm getting the hook.
You got 5.
Okay. So we put in, this was 2,100 pounds of rye at planting. So this is the second latest planting time. That was at June 7th, 4,380 pounds per acre of rye. And he's kind of the winner up in Gently. 9 days after planting, I guess winner or loser, depending how you look at it. He grew almost 5,000 pounds of rye. That's a lot of rye. But oddly, these are the results. You can see here the no rye, the at planting, and the after planting treatments all had higher yields than the plots where rye was terminated before planting. And so we racked our brains trying to figure out what was going on here because it just made no sense. Made no sense. Until we thought about something that Lindsay probably thinks about a great deal. Soil mineralization, our nitrogen dynamics in our fields. We had a lot of volunteer wheat, and that volunteer wheat, because it had laid flat, that's what you're seeing right here. This is where there was just some volunteer wheat growing the previous year, but you can see none of it's standing up. All of it's begun to degrade pretty darn well. And this is what it looked like the previous year. But so this is our theory, our working theory. We're thinking in this before planting plot, because the rye was still vegetative, it did eventually lay down. And so as it laid down, it began to break down. And there's a lot of carbon in that material, in that plant material. And so the microbes that are breaking down that plant material also need nitrogen in order to complete their life cycles. And so it can tie up nitrogen from the soil to break down the rye biomass. Because the at planting and then the after planting termination timings, those stayed standing basically all season long. So they never were in contact with the soil to begin breaking down. That's our theory. Key findings. So we don't have a ton of key findings, just that 2021 obviously was a historic drought up here. 2022 was more of a historic drought down in the west central part of the state. And then both areas of the state had a historically late 2022 planting season. So we're still trying to answer this question, how much is enough? Our goal is to figure out that sweet spot between growing enough rye to hold on to that soil and not cause us any headaches come springtime, and then not grow too much so that it negatively impacts our cash crop yield, because nobody's running a charity here. So this is what we're currently recommending. It's a pretty safe recommendation. Terminate rye before it goes reproductive. If you can't, try and roll it first, just so it does lay down. Next year, if nothing else, it will bring new data, new complications. We do have 3 on-farm locations that were planted in 2022 in the fall up near the Crookston area. We also have 2 trials that were planted at the Northwest and then the West Central Research and Outreach Center, where we're looking at rye seeding rates, we're looking at tillage, and then we're also looking at the termination timing, just in a little bit more detail in much smaller plots. So we'll have 6 on-farm trials and 2 more research center trials in 2023. Questions? Comments? Sir?
So do you think the soybean or the rye soybean, is that a allelopathic effect? Also, all the planting dates were late last year compared, so the chance for the rye to grow more is probably greater when it gets warm.
Right. So the question was, do we think that there was allelopathy going on? So one really common form of allelopathy that we can see is if you have a black walnut tree. It basically produces a compound that makes it so that nothing else can grow. Sometimes rye is thought of as being able to have these properties. The only time I've ever personally seen evidence of allelopathy has been with corn. When you were growing corn as the cash crop following the rye cover crop. That's only where I've seen it. But I really do think that in some of those instances that it probably was carbon to nitrogen ratio that was affecting us.
The other question is, so you looked at the above ground biomass.
Right.
Not counting for the below ground.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other damages with that cover crop. Did you do a total above ground biomass, adding the soybeans in the biomass at the end of the year?
Interesting question. So he asked whether in addition to our rye biomass, whether we also looked at, so I did mention that we looked at weed biomass as well. He wondered if we looked at total soybean biomass. That we didn't do. We didn't do that. We wouldn't, I guess we'd have to be looking at different time points, and sometimes with on-farm research, well, it's a lot of work, and you really need your cooperators. And they're already dealing with additional headaches because of the research process, and so we don't want to add to that any more than we have to. Because having these termination timings and everything, that really can delay things, or, mess around with when he's going to be able to come in with weed management and that sort of thing. So, other questions? Do we have time for one more? Yeah. No other questions? Oh, yes, sir.
On the wheat stubble, is there, or is it in your estimation that there would be that much difference for planting a rye in it, or rather than just letting the wheat stubble stand?
So this is a good question. He said, well, what about if you just let that wheat stubble stand? Now, granted, this was spring wheat, so the winter was going to kill it. Is that any better than planting rye and dealing with those extra management challenges? And I believe, so I serve on the Minnesota Wheat On-Farm Research Committee, can't remember, advisory committee. And that's one of the things that the wheat growers have a real interest in, because I know, just anecdotally speaking, I know it can definitely help with water infiltration in the soil. If you take a drive, just this coming spring, let's say we get a couple more nice big rain events, you can definitely see in those fields where the people didn't leave standing volunteer wheat, they have standing water if they tilled, whereas the people that left their volunteer wheat still standing, didn't till it, all that water will have infiltrated. And so I do know that there are differences there. The reason why they want to look at it as a cover crop option is to try and get cost share if it does provide some of these ecosystem services. So I'm not sure whether in the 2023 research project list, I don't think it made the cut for this time around, but maybe in 2024, because I know there's an interest. Yeah, but more and more people, it seems, are letting that wheat stubble just sit there and then allowing that volunteer wheat. I do know that Yoakum Wiersma has a real worry about that, just for next year's cash crops, the next year's small grains that are surrounding that. We're going to be setting ourselves up for more pest pressure. We don't yet know yet with the rye and with the wheat stubble as well. So definitely more research. Good question. Thanks for the question, guys.
Thank you, Angie. All right, we will move into our last but not least speaker of the day. James Cruz is our County Executive Director for Farm Service Agency of Norman County and Clay County. So he's going to give us an update on what's going on with all the FSA programs and anything else that might be happening at the FSA offices. So welcome, James. And if you guys have, as booth vendors, if you had any drawings or door prizes, after James's presentation, we'll have the drawing, a time to draw those winners for you guys.
Thank you, Heather. Just going to go through some program information. One of the things we've seen in this farm bill and going forward, a lot of emphasis on beginning farmer programs, not only on the financing side, but we also have some programs whereas payments were issued, beginning farmers, veteran beginning farmers, socially disadvantaged, those farmers all got an additional payment factor. So it's just some things to keep in mind. Who is a beginning farmer? For USDA definition, it's a beginning farmer has not operated a farm or ranch for more than 10 years at the time they apply for any benefits through USDA. And a veteran beginning farmer, they've served in the armed forces and have not operated a farm for more than 10 years also, and is a veteran who first obtained status as a veteran during the most recent 10-year period. So we talk about some additional benefits as socially disadvantaged, limited resource, beginning or veteran farmers. In order to obtain those additional benefits, an example was ERP Phase 1. If you were a beginning farmer and had certified as a beginning farmer, you got an additional 15% over what a non-beginning farmer received. So in order to receive those benefits, you do have to sign a certification form, and that's a CCC 860. It's called the Socially Disadvantaged Limited Resource Beginning and Veteran Farmer or Rancher Certification. So if you qualify as one of those, I highly encourage you to stop by or submit an 860 to your FSA office so you would be eligible for those benefits going forward. First program I want to talk about is we are in the 5th year of the Farm Bill. We do have the agriculture risk coverage. This is an income support program that provides payments when actual revenue falls below a guarantee level for the ARC part of it. And PLC is an income support when the effective price falls below a covered reference price. Two things that are happening now through March 15th. Under this Farm Bill, you have the ability to change your election every year. So those changes are optional. You do have the option to enroll that farm in ARC County or PLC, and that's on a crop-by-crop basis. Or if you decide you want to do the individual coverage using your own data, that would be for the entire farm. If an election is not submitted by March 15th, then you still have the same election you had in 2022. There are a couple web decision tools available. You got there's one through the University of Illinois and Texas A&M. Those are USDA kind of funded research ones. And there are, I know a lot of other universities, I believe NDSU still has one where you can look at that same information and see what program you might want to elect into. Keep in mind, I mentioned there's 2 phases. You have to do the election. If you make no changes, you still have to do the enrollment. So you have to annually enroll your share interest of the base acres. So even though election changes are optional, you still have to submit a signed contract. And if you did have a multi-year contract, back in 2019 when this Farm Bill started, you could have what was called the multi-year contract. As long as no changes were ever made to that farm, you didn't have to re-enroll. A lot of those changes have been made to different farms, so a lot of farms are no longer multi-year contracts. So just remember that election enrollment must be completed by March 15th. Along with that, you can, if you have a pretty good idea what you want to be elected into, you can enroll that farm tomorrow. And if 2 weeks from now you get talking to somebody, crop insurance agent, a banker, and they think you should go to a different way and you decide you'd want to, you can make that change all the way up until March 15th. So it's not locked in, but it can just help us for you to beat that rush. Next program I just want to talk about is we have at the present time a continuous CRP program which targets environmentally sensitive land. Acres offered must meet specific eligibility criteria by practice. Most of these contracts are 10 to 15 years in length. Always on our CRP programs, the soil rental rate that's offered on the contract is the weighted average of the 3 predominant soils. There are some signing incentive payments if it had never been enrolled in CRP, and certain practices then are also eligible for a one-time practice incentive payment that is paid with the cost share. And cost share is available for establishing these practices. Some things I want just to make you think about, consider for CRP. CRP program can help probably assist with the profitability of the farm. Maybe you have some edges of fields, maybe you have some high salinity areas, maybe just some areas, small areas that just aren't helping with the overall production. You can use a CRP program with some filter strips, areas of high salinity. We can kind of put CRP on that. And all of this can kind of help with the improving the profitability on those acres. If you have any of those areas you want to discuss, contact the FSA office. We can go through those with you. We don't have a date yet, but there will be a general CRP sign up sometime here this winter, early spring. If you are a beginning farmer, veteran, socially disadvantaged farmer, and you are working with somebody who's going to have their land expire out of CRP, one thing you may want to consider having them contact FSA about the transition incentive program, because if they do a long-term lease with a beginning socially disadvantaged veteran farmer, so that's a minimum of 5 years, they can get a CRP payment, an additional CRP payment for 2 years. And along with that, that should help hopefully with your rental rate that you can work with them. We have our livestock disaster programs. So you got the livestock indemnity program, which pays for death losses. So if there are some death losses this winter because of the weather over the normal mortality, keep those in mind. Livestock forage program will pay for grazing losses if there's a drought. Just keep good documentation, photographs, or good records, and just keep your livestock inventory records. We do have a non-insured crop disaster assistance program. So if you're growing something that's not insured by federal crop, you may want to look into that. I'm going to skip a couple of these. The marketing assistance loans, those are available. We want to make sure that if you're doing any changes, buying land, selling land, any of those, notify FSA of those changes. Acreage reporting, we could just encourage that, especially now with the cover crop. There might be a program again with that. We got the farm storage facility loan program. So you can kind of see up there, we got a lot of different things we can finance. If you're looking at any of those, contact our office. We do have lower interest rates at the present time, and we can help finance those activities. I'm going to skip over the details. A couple things I want to talk about just because they were announced on Monday. The Emergency Relief Program Phase 2 has been announced. This will be a disaster assistance for anybody that was impacted by disasters in 2020 and or 2021. So to be eligible, you would have to have suffered a loss in allowable gross income, or gross revenue. What they are doing with these two programs I'm going to talk about is essentially they are moving it to a revenue program. So it's going to be comparing items from your Schedule F from a base year, which is going to be 2018 or 2019, and compare it to 20 and or 21. So in general, the two payments are expected to be based on the difference in that farm revenue between a typical year and the disaster year. We do have some fact sheets here that were just, I think, released yesterday. If you are interested, I would highly recommend you get those afterwards. One thing there's a chart in there that'll tell you exactly on your Schedule F, line by line, what is allowable, because the application you'll have to fill out will say what that allowable income was in the base year and what it was in the disaster year. And then the sign-up period that they announced is going to start January 23rd and go through June 2nd. The other program that they announced along with that is the Pandemic Assistance Revenue Program, otherwise known as PARP. Basically, to be eligible for this, you had to be an ag producer that was in the business of farming at least part of or the full calendar year for 2020. And again, they're going to be looking at certain levels of revenue, comparing that from 18 or 19 to 2020. Those exact details have just been released. Like I said, I got some fact sheets. The sign-up period is going to be the same. This is the last in the series of programs that FSA did that Congress passed for the pandemic or through the COVID program or for the COVID period. So those fact sheets will tell you how to compare the two. The biggest thing I can tell you the way it's looking with the program right now is you're going to want to have probably 2 documents when you're preparing your application. That's going to be your Schedule F. So you can kind of see line by line what's allowable. And when you get your 1099 from the USDA, because there are certain government payments that are not allowable because they're part of the pandemic program already. So by having your 1099, you can see line by line what those government payments were that were on your taxes. Time?
Yeah, if you have questions.
Okay. Basically, a lot of programs, the new programs, the Emergency Relief Program 2, watch for that information. And I highly encourage, if you're not getting email bulletins from us or text messages, that you sign up for those. With that, any questions on any of the FSA programs? Like I said, I'll have the fact sheets here, so if you want to pick those up so you can kind of start looking at those 2 programs, that would be available.
Thank you, James. So now if the businesses had any door prizes, if they wanted to gather those, but before we get to that, I just want to make sure that we thank again all of our sponsors for today's program, our gold level sponsors and our maroon level sponsors. They've been noted several times around the room and along their booths and things like that. So thank you very much to all of those who helped us make a very great program today. There's a lot of good information, and I think my brain is a little bit overwhelmed right now too with all of some of the good information that was given out today. So we appreciate everybody coming in, and you guys as spectators and farmers, we appreciate all of that too. Please make sure to fill out those surveys that you were given when you registered. Those do help us build these programs better and better every year. So they are very important to our work and to show that we give you guys good information as well. So with that being said, whoever's first in line. Are we live? I gotta mix them up. Yeah. So we're gonna draw from the Bennett Hooglam Agency. I have no idea what's in here. And what are we drawing for, John?
Battery charger starter.
A battery charger starter.
Eric Rogstead.
Eric Rockstead. Austin Germolis Crop Insurance. These are little tiny pieces of paper. Yeah. I gotta get one. Got it. And what are you drawing for, Austin?
It's a tool, set of tools.
A set of tools, too.
Bruce Hagee.
Bruce Hagee. Who's next? Did anybody else have drawings at their tables? Marlene, did you have one? Oh, okay. 5 on the list. Mike Petrie.
Okay, was he here earlier?
Okay. All right. They got a tote from Minnesota Corn. and then a basket from Minnesota corn, or Minnesota soybeans. Rebecca Sip.
Yes, starts with you.
Is Rebecca here? All right. Thank you very much for all your attention today and your attendance. And thank you to everybody for sponsoring Norman County Ag Day. We look forward to coming back next year with another good program for you for next year. So thank you. Drive carefully and also be safe.
And thank you for joining us here on Wiley, your live event. .com, your live event YouTube page. We truly appreciate it. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the 45th annual Norman County Ag Day. Thank you to all of our sponsors for making this possible. Without them, we're not here broadcasting, we're not here pumping this information out to you guys. So make sure you are patronage, giving them your business. But with that being said, have a phenomenal rest of your day. For yourliveevent.com. Have a good one.